I'm Cornell Clayton, Director of the Foley Institute here at WSU. On behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our event today, which is a continuation of our series this semester on the politics of climate change. And we're really fortunate to have with us today actually one of my own colleagues in the School of PPPA here at WSU, but he's on the Vancouver campus. Mark Stephan is an associate professor in our department. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of California at Santa Cruz, and he received his PhD from Princeton University. His research focuses on governance, climate change, environmental justice, and environmental policy. Recently, Mark has been working with his colleagues on an NSF-funded multi-year study on climate change governance, which analyzes state and local connections through a polycentric lens. Mark has also recently, I just learned this today actually, was elected the president of the Board of Governors for City Club of Portland, which is the city's oldest civic organization. So it's a pleasure to have Mark with us on this side of the Cascades today. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for those who are joining us online. I'm happy to have this conversation with you. I want to start off actually with a bit of a disclaimer, which is that if you've been listening to and attending the lectures up till this point, and I've caught a lot of them online, you've been catching some really interesting work on climate change. I kind of sneaked mine in because this is really about states, and then I'm also talking about climate change. I could have come and talked with you about health policy and states, or abortion policy and states, and the politics of these things, and there would have been a lot of overlap. So for me, the main focus is on states, but of course we are going to talk a lot about climate change, policy, and politics along the way. Start here. So just a couple of things to mention, and actually I won't even really mention them, it's just as much as sort of show it to you. I'm going to talk a little bit about some background on some policy issues around the states and climate change. Do what I'm calling case illustrations. That's kind of maybe a stretch to call it a case illustration, but you'll see, focusing on things like energy production, consumption as well, and related policy areas. I'm going to talk briefly about the research that I've done with colleagues and try to highlight a couple of key points that's come from it, and then talk a little bit about the future of climate change, and then we'll see where it goes from there. So, a couple of things to mention right off the bat. Generally speaking, when I'm talking about policy, climate change policy in U.S. states, I'm focusing on mitigation, adaptation, and equity concerns. And I'm assuming that for this room that people are familiar with these terms and I don't have to define each one of them. If I'm wrong about that, you'll have to let me know later. But let me give you some examples of the sort of things that states are really interested in, and to some extent localities as well. First, clean energy, right? Fundamentally, how we shift our fuel base for our electricity needs in this country is a huge topic. It combines climate change policy with energy policy, and I'll be talking about it a fair amount. Things like carbon pricing. How do we, give incentives to the industrial sector, to the power sector, to actually reduce their carbon emissions? That's mitigation. Points about green growth, green buildings, that sort of stuff relates to adaptation. The idea that we have to not only try to slow down the process of carbon emissions, but we also have to adapt to changing circumstances. And then the equity aspect of all this. This is one example. Thinking about greening the workforce and doing it in low-income communities, allowing those communities to get some of the benefits from trying to shift the economy. And I want to say, going back to, not I think the last lecture, but the lecture after that, from Nevis and Asim, climate change is a political problem. They talked about this in their talk. It's maybe a problem in other sorts of ways as well, but it is fundamentally a political problem. And so I'm backing up an argument that they were making around that. So a couple of key things to keep in mind before I sort of move forward. First of all, up until quite recently, the federal action on climate change in the United States was incredibly limited. So if you think about the Clean Power Plan or the Paris Agreement, where there was a back and forth, the Paris Agreement is approved, the Paris Agreement is withdrawn, the Paris Agreement is it's a tennis match between the two major parties. the fact is that if you look at the last 20 years of climate change policy in the U.S., and especially compared to climate change policy in a lot of other countries, it's really been lacking. That said, we now have the Inflation Reduction Act from last year. A huge amount of money, much of which will go to states to help them work on climate change issues. This may help with issues of mitigation, adaptation, questions about equity and making things more equitable. The results of that Inflation Reduction Act, still unclear at this point. It's too early to see, but we might want to think about, at least speculate about how it might have an effect. So here's where I want to start with some examples of sort of differences across states, and keep it moving relatively quickly. One of the key ideas when you think about state comparisons is the idea of policy leaders and laggards. The idea that some states are moving ahead, some states are catching up slowly, or maybe never fully catching up, or maybe truly lagging and almost moving in the opposite direction. It's part of the work that we've done in our research. My colleagues and I has been focused on this leaders and laggards aspect of different parts of climate change policy. So some of this that I want to talk about is about energy production. Some of it's about energy consumption. I'm kind of conflating them at times, but I need your help with this. And I'm starting with what I think might be an easy one for you. Could you name a state that's a leader in hydroelectric energy production?
Washington.
Washington. Anybody else have any guesses besides Washington? Don't. Go with that one. By the way, I really, really am hoping to hear from people who aren't 100% sure about the answer. If you really know the answer, maybe hold it back for a second and let me see if someone else can figure this out. But yeah, let's go to Washington. A state leader in hydroelectric energy. All of those blue dots are dams around the state of Washington. I think a lot of us know this. But keep in mind there is also some conflicting environmental values if you haven't sort of discussed this in other classes of yours. There's the issue, especially along the Columbia and also the Snake River, of salmon recovery. Maybe having dams serves us in a certain way, but it conflicts with other values that we've got. In the state of Washington as well, we seem to really actually enjoy doing some crude oil refining. We've got 5 major refineries in the state. We're the 5th largest in the country for refining oil. So we get some economic gain from that as well. But yes, hydroelectric energy, for sure. All right, state leader in wind energy and solar energy. Any guesses, looking across the states, of what might be a leader, or one of the top leaders in the area of wind or solar?
California.
California? Okay, so I'm hearing from the same person twice, so you're cut off at this point. But California, for which one though? Solar? Wind? Huh? For solar? Okay, so let's say California for solar. That's a good guess. What about wind energy? What state is the top for wind energy?
Texas.
Texas makes sense. Any other guesses? Okay, we're doing pretty well so far. The fact is, when it comes to wind energy, Texas is at the top of the heap, producing roughly 26% of the nation's wind energy. Solar, California, top of the heap. But some things to keep in mind as well. For Texas, their crude oil production and refining is enormous. So as much as they are leading the way on wind energy, they're also still doing a lot when it comes to natural gas and crude oil. California, fantastic. All this work in solar energy. Also one of the top 2, maybe the top 1 in terms of gasoline consumption. Because of cars, Californians love their cars. Maybe they're loving more and more of their electric cars these days, but they're still loving their gas-guzzling cars. So you got some sort of tensions in each of these situations. Okay, it goes a little faster here. Nuclear energy, coal-based energy, natural gas energy. Any states come to mind that maybe stand out here? It's really okay to guess if you don't have a sense of it. Look across the states. Think about who might be top on nuclear, who might be top on coal. natural gas. No guesses. No one wants to be wrong. I understand that. Okay. I'll go ahead and let you know. Oh, is there any? Hand. People are talking, people aren't saying.
Arkansas.
Go ahead.
I'd probably guess for coal-based energy, it's probably West Virginia or Kentucky.
Okay, reasonable guesses, right?
Nuclear.
Any others? Nuclear?
Arkansas.
Arkansas has been mentioned for nuclear. Anything else in terms of natural gas? No thoughts? All right, so let's find out. When it comes to nuclear, it is definitely the state of Illinois. 11 nuclear plants still producing energy in that state. A big part of what the state is up to. And yet, their use of renewables is rising, right? So this is a shift that's occurring for them, but they still love their nuclear energy more so than any other state. State leader in coal-based energy, Wyoming. Wyoming loves coal, and I can't even think of a counterpose to that. Like wind energy, yeah, a little bit. They're doing some work in wind energy now, but for the most part, they just really love to, use their coal and produce it and produce energy for states like Washington and other states as well. Natural gas, we come back to Texas. Still huge, right? Doing the wind power, doing crude oil refining and production, also doing the natural gas production, doing all of those. So Texas really is huge in those ways. So part of what I'm trying to get to here is that every state is different in terms of we haven't talked as much about consumption, but their consumption as their what they're able to produce. But that variation really does matter to thinking about what drives climate change policy in those states. So here, not necessarily looking for examples, but you're welcome to sort of think a little bit about this for a minute or two. Which cities are leading in thinking about adaptation, how they're going to adapt to climate change? What cities are thinking about this in terms of climate justice issues or green buildings? Cities have been active well before states. Cities have been active on climate change policy well before the national government. Cities across the country. Now, does that have a larger ultimate impact in carbon emissions and sort of where we're going? It's a little bit more marginal, but maybe it has strong effects in terms of public opinion and shifts in our mindsets around climate change. So let me give you some examples. When it comes to adaptation, Washington, D.C. has been recognized, Denver has been recognized, Portland, Oregon, where I live, has been recognized. In terms of climate justice, there's been some amazing work done in places like Columbus, San Antonio, and San Diego. Chicago, San Francisco, and Atlanta, big cities who've been thinking hard about green buildings. And that last one is just for fun. It has no correlation with climate justice issues. But I did find this along the way. I was looking for all this other information, trying to get a sense of cities and the variations across them, and Boston, Long Beach, and Fort Worth came in as big donut cities. I have no idea what's going on there, but I thought I'd let you know, just in case you were curious about it. Okay, some more to mention around states, in particular around climate justice issues, environmental justice. First, New Jersey. New Jersey's been doing some tremendous work in the last 3 years based on their environmental justice law in 2020. Working to try to integrate thinking about equity issues across the entire state, across basically all the environmental work that they do. I have a joke here about the historically produced toxic waste in Jersey, but it's actually pretty accurate. This is a state that has a huge chemical industry. This is a state who has a huge industry overall that has done a lot in previous decades to create toxic pollution, to land, to water, to air. So at this point, it's maybe about them turning that corner and saying maybe we can do something better in that regard. Washington State, is considered a leader by many other states when it comes to environmental justice. In this case, in terms of thinking about planning issues within the state, at the county and at the local level, at the state level. We can't say for sure that Governor Inslee has been the greenest governor in the history of governors, But he's going to be in the top 5 at the rate he's going, or possibly the most focused on this in the time that he has spent in office. Again, we could argue about what criteria are used to sort of evaluate this, but if you think of it just in terms of public policy, just in terms of trying to shift the focus of the state, they stand out quite a bit. So in doing all of this, and here I'm going to need to take a second, and we'll see how well this works. I'm going to try to end the slide slow for just a second, because I just want to show you something. Okay, Richard's not going to like it. All right, so you may have noticed that there were a certain set of states that didn't show up in any of what I was talking about before. Some cities from the South, but not other southern states. Deep South states, for the most part, have not been leaders on climate change policy. Some of them have been thinking about adaptation. Think about Louisiana. Think about, Florida, though not a deep South state, still a state in the South. Miami has certainly thought about it. The state of Florida has been thinking about it. But what I was trying to get to is that where states falter, organizations within those states or across those states, in many cases, step up. So this organization, the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, is an example of what I'm talking about. An organization that is responding to the lack of focus on climate change issues by the states themselves, the state governments themselves. So there is that sort of action as well. Let's go back to this. All right. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about my own research in the context of what I've just been talking about in terms of the variation across states. I've been working with colleagues on trying to think about why we see variation across states in their reduction of emissions over time, and what sort of factors are sort of at play here. So when you look at state by state, how well are they reducing carbon emissions over time? And trying to think about, okay, so what is that about? Is that simply economic factors? Is it political factors? Is other social, public opinion factors? What's at play here? Key to this is the notion of greenhouse gas emissions over time. It's not about the amount of gas emissions per se. It's about, are they making improvements? Are they dropping their emissions? How much? How dramatically? Are they increasing them? What's going on? So we think about this in terms of theory in 3 different ways. This notion of polycentricity, which is actually as it sounds. It's nothing particularly fancy at its core. It is the idea that there is many centers of decision making, many centers of government that are influential in something like climate change. So we think through the governance relationships across different decision centers. Decision centers could be a city, it could be a state. We think about those as part of our overall analysis. We use work from corporate social responsibility literature, which basically is what, again, it sounds like. It's about how industry, some of it, not all of it, steps up and does more than they have to for their profit line, for their profit motive. They step up and maybe push environmental values, are stewards of environmental values. Not all of them, but there's a whole sort of question that's in the literature, not question, but really the research itself that sort of looks at what is it that drives businesses to do more than they're asked to do. Where are their incentives? Finally, we do some work using the IAD, the Institutional Analysis and Development Framework, which is pictured here. It's a basic schematic to try to understand the decision making. So we're trying to understand decision making within each state and then connect it to the sort of outcomes we see in those states. We do so by controlling for a bunch of other factors I can talk about if people are interested, but I will talk about later only if there are questions about it. Instead, what I want to do now is just talk about some of the highlights of the work. So, the methods we used were mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative methods to try to make sense of this. And though we had other results as well, the only thing that seemed to be compelling across our analyses were these 2 points. First, the relevance of a particular initiative, RGGI, as it's called, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And then this point about overlapping decision centers that I also described as policy diversity. So let me talk about each one of those. RGGI, and this picture here sort of captures the states that are involved in RGGI, is a cooperative relationship between states in a particular region of the country trying to figure out how to reduce carbon emissions, in particular in the power sector. So they're working with each other. They're using carbon pricing, cap and trade sort of methods to actually reduce the level of emissions for the overall region. That seems to be an important factor. That cooperation seems to be a major factor for states overall. Any sort of signs of cooperation, but this is a particularly important one, really matters. So to the extent that states are cooperating with each other. The other part of it that maybe is the most interesting to this conversation is this point about policy diversity. And it's simply this: some states do a variety of things to try to deal with climate change. Some do almost nothing, and many are in between. The more sort of policy diversity that we saw, the more they were using different types of policy mechanisms, the better the reduction in emissions over time. So it gave some evidence to us, and there's certainly more work to be done here, about thinking about how states, working on their own, working with others, can help have an impact. I mean, the thing that I didn't say that maybe I should have said right at the very beginning when I talked about the federal government, and I talked about the lack of work by the federal government, is that the real action has been, as I mentioned, about in the cities, but in particular at the state level. If you want to understand climate change policy, not necessarily going forward, but in the last 20 years, it's not really a question about looking at what the federal government has done. It is fundamentally about what the states have done or chosen not to do in some cases around climate change. So what sort of shifts might we see from this point? A lot of this has to do with how states take advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act. Look, if the federal government is strong in its purpose and it works with states to try to promote programs and spending to try to reduce the use of fossil fuels and increase renewables, there may be some really important gains, right? Leaders and laggards may separate even more because the laggards aren't taking that opportunity and the leaders are pushing ahead. It might be that there's a rising boat for all. It's not entirely clear, but at least some would move ahead. If there's weak federal implementation of the IRA, if the Inflation Reduction Act isn't effectively used, it's going to be something else entirely. It may be just a repeat of what we've been doing, or maybe even in some cases some reversals if it's not done well, both in terms of what the feds do, but also in terms of what the states do. Let me try to give a quick explanation of what I'm talking about here. So I have a simple 2x2 here, right? Thinking about partisanship and political ideology, which I'm basically conflating, and these days I think that's a fair conflation. And then thinking about where their energy interests are. Do they lean towards fossil fuels or do they lean towards renewables? And so there's these 4 categories. These states are just examples of what I'm getting at, right? States that are exacerbators, meaning they're exacerbating the problem of climate change because they're actually more than happy to continue to emit carbon. Wyoming, right? I haven't gone to look, but I am almost 100% sure that if you were to go and look at the written record for the legislature in Wyoming, you would find at least one state legislator saying, we're producing carbon emissions, we're going to do more of it, we're going to keep doing more of it, we're happy to do it. There's almost that level of celebration at times. Not across all the state legislators, but across at least some. So that's the exacerbators, right? The profiteers, right, is the term I'm using. Texas is not a state that is really excited about climate change policy. It's excited about making money. And if they can make money, they'll do it. So if you can give them the incentive to do it, they'll do it. They're doing enormous work in wind energy. They're starting to push farther into solar energy. Not because they think it's the right thing to do, but they think as a state that it's the place that they can economically make gains. So that's that side. And there's other states that are similar, if not exactly the same. The mitigators, right, are sort of the standard case of states like California and others who are all in on trying to deal with climate change. And they're focusing on expanding renewables and doing what they can. The reluctants, to me, are the most interesting example in this group. Reluctants are states that lean towards the Democratic Party, that lean in the liberal direction, at least somewhat. Pennsylvania is not a perfect example of that, but I think it's a fair example of that. But who are also pretty much still somewhat stuck focusing on fossil fuels. And so they're not making the changes that the mitigators are. They're not moving in the same direction, but they're still kind of stuck on fossil fuels. So what happens if you now focus on the influence of the Inflation Reduction Act, potentially? What happens is that all of a sudden Wyoming changes its tune. If they have enough incentives to do so, there's good money to be made in wind and solar in the state of Wyoming. Maybe they're going to do more of that because they're given the opportunity through monies that they can get from the Inflation Reduction Act. Same with Pennsylvania, can move into that mitigator category where all states basically, or most states, are moving towards renewables in a more dramatic way. That's a possibility with this act. It's not necessarily an assured thing by any means, but it's a possibility. I did have one last slide, which I'm going to just sort of put up there. And we can talk about it if people have questions about it and are curious about it. But I'm not going to go into it at length here because it would sort of push us too far time-wise. What I'd rather find out is what questions you have, what you would find interesting to talk about, and get your perspectives on all of this. That is it.
Okay.
I'll open it up for questions.
All right. We have about 25 minutes or so for Q&A. Maybe I'll start us off.
Yeah.
I'm curious that whenever you hear a talk about state politics and
Yeah.
policy, somebody mentions Danielle Olsor, right?
Right.
And state culture and
Yep.
regional cultures. Do you have you looked at that, A, and B, do you think it makes any difference? I mean, certainly some states like Washington have a more moralistic culture. We tend to see things in moralistic terms, which might explain why we're so engaged in climate mitigation. And
Yeah, so
climate change, right?
in some earlier versions of what we did, we included some variables trying to capture some of the Ellsberg sort of culture stuff, state culture stuff. And we found that, first of all, we couldn't find anything quantitatively to grab onto. And then when we looked at it qualitatively, we found that, I think we need a new Ellsberg evaluation of states. I think we need to think, because we still need to think about culture, but the way that is playing out, how many years after? There's been some attempts to sort of update it, but it's, it hasn't had traction in our work. Doesn't mean that culture doesn't matter. And it doesn't mean that things like, Washington state political culture doesn't matter. But we haven't been able to find a way to sort of look at patterns or find, something that we can grab a hold of in that regard.
I'm curious. The Reggie, was it Reggie?
Reggie, yeah.
That's in the Northeast.
Yeah.
Which might explain the culture of the Northeast might explain that, right?
Yeah. Okay. So, but then that's why
greater cooperation.
Right. So that actually gets to the updating that needs to be done, because I'm pretty sure that group of states, Pennsylvania, Virginia, New York, all the way up into the Northeast, that they don't have the same culture by Ellsberg's sort of measurement of it. So yeah, but again, I think culture does have to play in here somehow, and maybe we're capturing it in other sorts of ways. So, other questions, comments, here and then here?
So I have two, kind of curious for both answers, unrelated. First of all, in that 2x2 table you have,
Yeah.
what are the numbers that populate each square? Are they sort of 12, 13 in each square, pretty evenly distributed, or how does that work?
Okay, so first thing, an admission, I haven't yet done the full.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Second, exacerbators are definitely a smaller number. Mitigators are a fair number, but I can't give you exact numbers because I don't have that for all of them. I'm trying to think about, actually, exacerbators and profiteers are not too different from each other. So that leaves a lot of states. Well, okay. I need to do that and get back to you.
Okay.
Because
I was
don't
just
have that.
curious. That's
Yeah. Because I started conceptualizing that. That's not been a part of the original research. That was a part of what I've been trying to articulate since that point, and I haven't gotten very far with it.
But the second question is, who's most important in changing the policy here, the governor or the legislature? And I guess over the short term versus the long term.
The easy answer, and I think it's the correct answer, is that we can't effectively break that down too much. As it's consistently across states, one is one or the other. There are times when the legislature leads, and time when the governor leads, to some extent, unless there's going to be stalemate, which happens a fair amount, they need the other one to follow. But in terms of who sort of takes the first step, in some of these states, it has clearly been the legislatures. In other states, it has been pretty clearly the governor, or some sort of combination of the two. And that includes both those who are leaders and those who are laggards. The true, like the serious laggards, and I'm thinking, and that's the terminology in the literature, is like Wyoming, and this has been, the state legislature and the governor have been fully committed to coal. And then there are those in the middle where there's a battle across the legislative and the governor's side. So, yeah.
So it builds on that last question. Last week we had Bob Inglis here, and he said the shocking realization for politicians is that they don't lead, they follow. So I was wondering how you reconcile that with your idea of institutional polycentricity, making the decisions, then moving ahead, and then finding that in with the last question about who moves first, is it the governor or the
Right.
the constituents?
So but just to clarify that quote, if they don't lead, they follow. Who are they following?
Well, they're trying to gauge public opinion on where their constituents would like to go, and then
Yeah.
you jump in the appropriate direction.
Well, this gets back on some level to it's related at least to the political culture sort of question, which is to what extent is the public driving the leaders to act in certain ways. And at least what we found is that public opinion may play a role, but it's very much in the background. It may set the tone, but it's not necessarily, yes, particular leaders are responsive to constituents. But what's true in climate change is that they're also very responsive to business interests in the state. And those business interests can go in a variety of directions themselves. They can be leaders or laggards in trying to promote climate change. And so, for them at least, for the governors, I'm thinking of governors but also state legislators, public opinion is not, as I understand it in our work, as direct a part of the conversation. It might be the step before us trying to figure out the actions of the states. And we do things like in some of our models we look at interest groups and interest group behavior across states as a way of measuring some of this as well. It's not public opinion, it's a little bit different. We haven't found necessarily the best public opinion work to incorporate into our analysis, so maybe there's still some questions about that step before their action. But once we get to their action, and then we think about its relationship to emissions, that's where we sort of spend our time. That was a half answer at best. Yeah. Other questions, other curiosities about this?
I remember there was something in the news sometime in the last 20 years that the administration of the University of Wyoming had informed the faculty that they should not talk about climate change.
Yeah.
You know about that?
Yes. Yeah. No, there was a determined effort by the state legislature and to some extent the governor as well to basically say, this is not a conversation we're having in the state of Wyoming. This is coal country. We're gonna focus on our priorities. And so this is part of what's led us to think about the idea of exacerbators, right? rather than laggards. Laggards suggest, well, they really want to do it, but they're kind of behind everybody else. If they're exacerbating the problem, they're not just trying to catch up. They're kind of trying to basically stay where they are or move in the other direction. And to the extent that some states are doing a mixture of these two, right? And that's why some of this is more illustrative than necessarily a solid look at states. Because some states, I think of the Dakotas, for example, might be doing some stuff that's going in both directions at the same time. And Texas is probably the best example of a state that's why I call it a profiteer. But the fact is that they're doing all sorts of stuff for wind energy that everyone who cares about renewables should praise the state of Texas for doing so much on wind energy, and yet at the same time, right on the other hand, they are continuing to move on fossil fuels as strongly as they can. Again, and will do so as long as they can make a profit doing so. And it's of course not the state government that's doing that profiting per se, but it's the relationship between the state legislature and the governor and the people in these industries that really matter. Questions? Comments? Here.
Yeah, so out of those 4 categories, what would you say that most states fall under?
Well, this is where I was sort of trying to answer this before. I think a fair number of them, more than probably a fourth, certainly maybe like 30%, 33%, a third of them, are going to be in the mitigation, right? They are committed to it. They're focused on it. They don't necessarily have the huge natural resources that like a Texas does or a Wyoming does, or they don't have the nuclear power that Illinois has. But they're trying to make progress. Some of these states, back to the RGGI states in New England, they don't have a huge industrial base. Their emission levels are actually relatively low, but they're still able to reduce their emissions because they're working in cooperation with each other. Other states like New York, it's industry, and the power sector itself, trying to figure out how to shift the power sector in a way that is not using fossil fuels and is moving towards renewables. And these states collectively have done a lot more in that regard than anybody else, including the mammoth of California. California is its own country to some extent in terms of its economy, in terms of its emissions and all that sort of thing, and its ability to sort of shift where the country's going on things like solar. But even they, in terms of their overall emission changes over time, have not made some of the significant improvements that the RGGI states, those mid-Atlantic and northeast states have been able to do. But other questions, other comments?
Let me take another shot at
Yeah.
and try and tease out a more systematic explanation for the variation in state policy responses. Culture could be one. The other, it seems the obvious one to me, maybe you've controlled for this, I don't know, is partisan control of state government over time. I would expect states controlled by Democrats over time are going to be on the forefront of addressing climate change, and those that have Republican control over time would not be. Do you control for that, or how are you dealing with that?
Yeah, I need to think that I don't think we do control for it. And one thing that I was going to do and I didn't do was load up our paper, this recent paper up here to look at some of the variables and think about that. We do have some stuff for partisan control, and I'm not remembering exactly what they are. But I'm realizing, even as you asked the question, that there's a little bit of a disconnect here. So normally, a lot of analysis looking at public policy focuses on the factors that influence the policy choices, right? We're looking at how do the policy choices affect the outcomes. And so there's that step before, like that partisan sort of difference that may help to explain the policy choices, but it may, in fact, I think we've looked at this, won't explain necessarily the emissions that change over time, the carbon emissions that change over time. A lot of what we're looking at, and this gets back to some of the other questions as well, a lot of what we're looking at is not about trying to explain why some states have certain policies and why others don't. It's saying, given that they've got these policies, what are the implications for what happens in those states? And that actually leads to a further sort of comment about this, is that part of the risk of our work is that we're not arguing necessarily that there's this direct relationship between the policy choices a state makes and what happens in the state. That's going to sound a little strange, but the idea is that the policy choices of a state set the context for the decisions that occur within the state by business interests in particular, local governments, county governments, that kind of thing. And they set basically a tone, that's at least part of the argument, they set a tone for the state and help to maybe reinforce the public opinion in the state as well when it comes to trying to reduce carbon emissions and try to move in a climate change direction that is not the direction we've been going as a country for so long now. So we're obsessed as a group, and maybe it's just us, with the outcomes and the shifts in the outcomes, meaning changes in carbon emissions, less than we are kind of explaining where the policies themselves came from. Again, partly answering the question that you're asking. Anything else? Yeah, go ahead.
You made a qualification in part of your thing in terms of industry and industry attitudes and pointing out one of the things of the TV ads you see where you have terribly green sounding oil companies. But I guess my particular question is and you raised the possibility that it wasn't exactly, I wanted to think of sort of fake policy. I want to think in terms of it's a cover that has really very little to do with anything other than public opinion and so forth, making us look good, but rather in terms of what they actually do. What they do is they hire an advertising company, they hire somebody to put out pretty policy, but it's all a cover for trying to make, as I would say, as much money as possible however they can. But my question?
So, I mean, what I hear you talking about is the concern of what's called by many greenwashing. Basically, industry saying, hey, we're green, we're with you, we're green, we're going to help with climate change. And then actually not making changes, right? But the thing that I didn't explain about the work that we're doing is that we have data going back, 10 years, more than 10 years in fact, looking at industrial and power plant emissions on a yearly basis of their actual emissions. So we don't care what they're greenwashing, right? We don't care what they're saying because we're looking at the actual changes over time and then looking at it across states. So we're accumulating the information in a given state. Look at the state of Washington, look at all the oil refineries, the other industrial sites. How much are they emitting of carbon in a given year? This is data that we now have. Look at that over time and say, hey, how does that connect to factors about the state, including its policy designs, including their economic factors? I mean, the largest factor, there's one factor in particular that is the big explanation for how a power plant or a state performs in carbon emissions in a given year. And that's how they performed in the year before. It's what's called lagged emissions. A lot of it's just explained by what did they do before, but the rest of the margin there, that's not just about what they did before, just doing it the same thing again. If they're heading down, if they're decreasing their emissions, then in fact something else is going on here that's simply more than just what they did last year or the year before. So these are the other factors that we're interested in: is how do states basically set a context for industry and power plants to reduce their carbon emissions, and to try to make sense of that for future planning for policy as well.
So you've talked about collaboration among states, especially in this RGGI initiative, is successful in reducing carbon emissions. Can you explain, I guess, a bit more why, or what's the mechanism behind that?
Why
has it been successful?
Oh, why has it been successful? No, I don't think I can. Because that's not what we're looking at. We're not looking at the why it's been successful for RGGI states. We're looking for the idea that cooperation seems to indicate, as a general sort of factor, emission reductions. I mean, I can tell you what others have said about this, right? Others have written about RGGI, and they've talked about the fact that states can more harmonize their own power production, reducing emissions along the way, work together to incentivize that same reduction in emissions and get renewables up, learn from each other, so a policy learning sort of arguments as well. These are all sort of standard arguments that have been made about RGGI and why it seems to have worked so well. By the way, other states have tried. There have been attempts in the Midwest for states to work together, fell apart. West Coast states, including Washington State, tried to work with Oregon and California and British Columbia. Didn't go anywhere. So there have been other attempts that have failed, and that's also worth keeping in mind, is that sometimes they don't even get started. But once RGGI gets started and adding states, it really seems to have had an impact. So that's my sense of it. Yeah.
Just a partial follow-up, I guess. Factoring in, again, industry behavior, carbon emission behavior, they are destroying the very environments that they feed off of. And therefore, when you put refineries on the coast and you have all sorts of economic problems because they flood more often, because the Gulf of Mexico is rising. Do you ever factor in that potential possibility that all of this is partially irrelevant to the fact that they are in the process of destroying the very thing that they sort of feed off of, and therefore have to change their behavior a little bit, or not? I don't know.
Not exactly, but you're making me think of another factor that we did look at, which is this my phone?
Sorry.
Okay. So one of the things that we looked at were state vulnerability to disasters, human-made or to naturally created disasters. And ultimately we didn't find anything that really stood out for us, but there were some initial indications that that this was also a causal factor for states, meaning that states with higher levels of vulnerability to natural disasters or human disasters potentially as well. Wildfire disasters are both human and natural combined, basically. That you also saw states moving towards reducing their emissions at the same, afterwards, right? So that the vulnerability they felt seems to be related to, but that's a little bit different than what you're talking about. So I don't think we have any sort of measure that captures that. I'd have to think about why we would include it or not. I mean, theoretically, but it's an interesting question about sort of industry sort of eating away at the overall environmental health of the state. But at the same time, I think about Wyoming, where coal is king, and they're destroying the environment in a lot of parts of the state. And I'm not trying to I'm going to get harsh email traffic now about Wyoming, but they're doing it anyway because there's a profit, right? So I mean, I get your point about the potential risks involved. At the same time, a key part of this is the income streams, and those can play off each other in important ways. So, thanks.
Time for one more question, if there is one.
Is there a way of measuring how much influence, particular, especially energy industry, has on the politics of the city or the state as a sort of a variable that would help to explain,
there's definitely some stuff around sort of energy interest as in terms of interest groups and interest group activity. And we do have some qualitative evidence around influence at the state level. What's interesting to me is that there's almost a complete disconnect between the energy industry and cities in terms of their politics. Cities are driven by a whole set of factors that are not the same as states. That is true, and they've been pushing on environmental change, many cities, for decades when states have done very little. So there I don't see the connection, but at the state level there's something, but part of what you're getting at then makes me think, okay, yeah, we need to now think about sort of the wraparound effect, right, of the energy industry on legislators, on what's happening ultimately in terms of emissions. That's maybe the next 10 years project for me. Yeah. So,
Yeah, glad to keep you busy.
yeah, thanks.
All right. Well, before I ask you and joining me in thanking Mark, let me remind you, anybody here for the Common Reading Program, there'll be a QR code up here later you can scan, or you can see Richard. Next week our series continues. We have Roberta Milstein from UC Davis. She's a philosopher. She'll be talking about, do we have ethical obligations to the land? And that'll be same time, same place next Thursday. But join me now in thanking Mark Stephan for next week.